Siveza iqiniso sivuselela ukuthembeka.
But next, we're going to hear from Christie Keulder, who is a researcher and an absolutely brilliant mind at the Afrobarometer. And I'm sure, as everybody knows, the Afrobarometer is a Pan-African institution conducting public attitude surveys on democracy, governance, the economy, and society. Christie's session today will focus on restoring trust in the media and communicating with the audiences on the platforms that they most trust. So Christie, if you're ready, it's over to you.
So thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas with you and share some of the data that Afrobarometer has been collecting over time. This project has been running since 1999, and I think it is the most comprehensive project of its sort on the continent. Zoe asked me to talk a little bit about trust in the media, and I thought what I would do is start off by providing a little bit of a context of some of the trends that we observe currently in the world, and then move on to have a look and see how media is used in Africa, also some of the challenges, and then the all-important position of why we should continue to strengthen the media and build trust. So in terms of where we are at the moment, with regard to democracy and freedom, and I borrowed this from Freedom House, you can see that things aren't all that great. Up until the early 1990s, the world had seen an explosion in democracies. That trend has now been reversed. And you can see since 2005 to last year, it's the 15th year in a row at which the number of countries in which freedom has improved is significantly less than the number of countries in which freedoms have declined. And they speak about the long democratic recession that we're in. Some of our largest democracies, such as India, for example, has now been reclassified away from being free to partially free. The United States is another old democracy that has been reclassified. So with regard to the media, I think the context within which we live is becoming more and more difficult and has been doing so over the last 15 years. So if we move on and have a look and see what the sort of dominant trends are, since 2005, you can see that the number of countries that were classified by Freedom House as free has declined from 89 countries to 82. The number of partially free countries has remained more or less the same. And then the worrying aspect, perhaps, is the large increase in the number of countries that were classified as not free. And I think if the political context is becoming more authoritarian, it is going to put more and more pressure on the media as well as media freedom. So I think it's difficult times for all of us. I want to share just a few pieces of information about the survey that the data comes from. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Afrobarometer. It is a Pan-African non-partisan research network that has been running since 1999. We have currently completed 8 rounds of surveys, and we've started with field work in Namibia for round 9 already. So round 8, where this data comes from, had an interruption with COVID, which meant that after we restarted the survey, we actually had a very good opportunity to add a module on COVID to those 16 countries, which now allows us to compare how countries felt that didn't have COVID versus countries that did have COVID. There's not a lot that's been done about that already, but that's definitely one thing we're looking at. It is a face-to-face interview that consists of a sample of 1,200 in Namibia's case, for example. Larger countries like Nigeria and South Africa, we asked 2,400 people, and it has a error term that falls well within internationally accepted standards, as well as a very high confidence level. So the total sample size is 48,084 individuals that's been interviewed across these countries. And there's a little bit of technical information about weighting. The countries that were included are all listed here, and you can see where the previous survey rounds have been conducted. You can go through this on your own time. On these countries, all of them. So I thought it would be better if we do that. I also include an average for the continent, or these 34 countries as a whole, which then means that whatever countries are within your interest, you can always look up and look for them in these analyses, and also relate them to where they fall compared to the average. The first theme that I want to share a few ideas on is the idea of media usage. In each of the presentations, I've actually put the actual questionnaire question. If we look at this graph, then and we look at the blue column or the blue row, we could see that radio is the most popular medium for obtaining information or news about politics on a daily basis. So 45% of Africans rely on the radio for news about politics every day. Another 23% rely on the same medium for news a few times a week. Television is the second most important, followed by newspapers, and then perhaps two elements that people find surprising: social media and internet. And this doesn't mean this is not the same as using it. This is just to use it for. This probably means that most people Africans that use social media, use it for reasons other than to obtain news about politics. Entertainment or networking or all these kinds of things. So radio remains the most important platform. The one area that I think is worrying is print media that is taken a serious nosedive. We've seen that now over time that the number of people who frequently use newspapers has declined. If we look at the yellow sections on the right, then that tells us something about the percentage of the population not ever using this medium for politics or news about politics. So, for example, the internet, 54%, social media, 51%, but look at print, it's 64%. So 64% of Africans never use newspapers to obtain news about politics. Television is 33%, and then radio, we see, is 18%. So I think in terms of the media landscape, this is a significant indication of what media is becoming important, what media is dropping in importance, and how we find a way to move forward or deal with the kinds of problems that these various media outlets have got. We've also got a section that asks about false information, or the sort of populist term fake news. And we wanted to ask who are seen as the most likely source of false information? Where does it come from? And you see that the majority of Africans of voting age 63% of them says that social media users is the most likely source of false information. And if you look at the question at the bottom, these are people who say often or sometimes. So I've combined those to say that the most likely source of false information are media users, then second politicians and political parties, then journalists and media, then government officials, and then activists and interest groups. And I think for this audience, it is important to note that 1 out of 2 Africans regard media or journalists as the source of false information, which I think is a problem. It is also a problem of trust if you compare it with government officials. It is the same. So the media and government are equal in how often they're perceived to be the source of false information. So I think that is an important issue that needs to be addressed in this context of rebuilding trust in the media. So, of course, Africa is a very complex continent. There's great diversity. So I also thought it might be useful if we look at the distribution of these opinions across countries. And in every case, I've included the 34-country average. So the average African, or the average for the African continent is 50%. This one deals specifically with media as a source of false information. So countries below average include Tanzania, Kenya, Angola, Mozambique, Lesotho, Niger, Malawi, and so forth. Countries where the media is perceived as a source of false information with above average scores include Senegal, Liberia, Ghana, Gabon, Tunisia, South Africa, and Namibia very close together, with Eswatini as Southern African countries. And you can see, for example, in Senegal, that the distrust in media is up at 74%, nearly 3 in every 4 Senegalese. South Africa is 64%, so pretty much 2 out of every 3. Namibia is the same, and Eswatini too. So what we're saying is that when we look at addressing this kind of problem, it's not always that one strategy would work or one approach would work, that we need to be aware of where countries are positioned on these variables. Another topic is to look at the public support that has emerged for media censorship by government. And as I said in the beginning, we have to understand this context in which freedoms have, as a rule, been on the decline. So the question was whether governments should be able to limit the sharing of news, information, or opinions through the media, and whether, what kind of information should they be able to censor. So 76% of Africans felt that the sharing of false news or false information should be limited. 71% felt that hate speech should be limited. And then what I think is very worrying, there's 61% who felt that criticism of the president should be limited. And then news and information that government disapproves of, it's nearly half of the continent. So the worrying aspect here is, whereas we could find justifications for saying it's good that people don't promote hate speech, or the media don't promote hate speech, these last 2 elements, of course, is problematic in the context of securing democracy, sustaining democracy, and the free media. I think also it says something about this, the importance of this context that we're currently in. Looking at media freedom, what is the current state of media freedom? We ask Africans to report on how free they perceive their media to be. just more than 1 in every 4 Africans think that their media is very free. 34% said it's somewhat free. So if we add those up, then just over 60% of Africans felt that their media was free. On the other side, there are about 33% who feels the opposite. That is a significant number, 33% of the African population. So again, if we break this down by country, we see that the average for the 34 countries included in the sample is 61%. In terms of media freedom. So this is either totally or substantially free. Countries in which media freedom seems high: Gambia, Namibia, Burkina Faso, Tanzania. And maybe at this point, just to bring a bit of attention to Tanzania, I've just recently completed a section on corruption in Africa using the same data. And Tanzania is the one country where perceptions on corruption has declined and improved substantially. Tanzania is really the one country that has made a lot of progress towards curbing that problem. And I think if we look at all these additional variables, we begin to understand that changes in Tanzania has been introduced that actually made a difference in the quality of the democracy in that country. So South Africa, Mauritius, or other Southern African countries, Mozambique that has above average freedom. Media freedom, Lesotho is a Southern African country, Angola, Zimbabwe, Zambia. These are all Southern African countries where the freedom, the current media freedom, is below average for the continent. If we look at public support for media freedom, we've asked them to choose between 1 or 2 statements. 1, the media should have the right to publish any views and ideas about government without government control. Statement 2 is that the government should have the right to prevent the media from publishing things it disapproves of. So if we look at this, then we can see that the public support for media freedom is just over 60%. So that's a healthy majority. As I said, there's also the other side, that 36% of Africans agree that government should censor or should have the right to censor the media, which I think is worrying depending on where you live and, of course, where you work. So if we look at the same thing, the same questions, and we break it down, where is the biggest support for media freedom? We find Gabon, Cabo Verde, Zimbabwe, Senegal, Uganda are all countries in which there's a lot of support for government being free, the media being free from government interference. You can see South Africa, Eswatini, Botswana are other Southern African countries. Namibia, for example, is an interesting case because despite the fact that the country is perceived, or the media is perceived to be very free in Namibia, it is also the one where people seem to support the notion that the government should have the right to interfere, but quite substantively. Here, only 55%, just over half the population, agrees that the media should be free. So again, Namibia, Angola, Tanzania are countries in which perhaps the opinion is moving towards support for media censorship. So there's also a question that asks whether the same format question. Statement 1 says the news media should constantly investigate and report on government mistakes and corruption. Statement 2 says too much reporting on negative events like government mistakes and corruption only harms the country. And you can see that here, slightly more people agree that media should monitor government. So there's this perception that the media has a particular role to play and that they should be allowed to play that role. If we break this down, support for media monitoring government's mistakes and corruption, We see countries like Cabo Verde, it's 85%, Ghana is 83%, Kenya is 80%. If we move down the list, then we find Tanzania, Zambia, Mauritius, in Malawi, Southern African countries that are above average for the continent, Botswana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Lesotho, Namibia are all below that average, which also suggests that Southern Africa perhaps needs a bit of support in this case. Why is the media important? I think, it's not a question of saying, it's got a regulatory role or that it is essential for democracies, but it also has a more indirect impact. And this is the sort of things that I would like to highlight. So the first is, if we look at the current state of media freedom and we look at satisfaction with democracy, we assume within the Afrobarometer network that satisfaction with democracy would lead to increased support for democracy. In other words, that people would continue to support democracy if and when they're satisfied with the way it's performing. So to what extent does the current state of media freedom have an impact on how satisfied people are with their democracy? And if we only put these two variables in this equation, then media freedom, the current state of media freedom explains about 28 or 30% of the satisfaction of democracy by itself. So it is actually quite an important variable. In order for us to understand satisfaction with democracy, we have to take into consideration what the current state of media freedom in this country would be. So the way I've set this up is that the purple and the red lines indicate the averages. And if we look at the various sections up here, where you see Tanzania, for example, these are countries where you have high levels of media freedom and high levels of satisfaction with democracy. And this is actually where we all would like to see our countries. Tanzania, Ghana, Kenya, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Tunisia, they're all countries in which media freedom and satisfaction with democracy are above average. If we move down and we move into the section just below it, we see Gambia, Senegal, Mozambique, South Africa, Malawi, Kenya, Cabo Verde. These are countries in which there is substantive, in other words, above average media freedom, but satisfaction with democracy is low. So in this case, we would like them to move up north, if you like, into that section defined by Tanzania. We want these countries to have increased satisfaction with democracy. If we look at the lower quadrant to the left, Liberia, Gabon, Eswatini, Zimbabwe, Zambia, these are all countries that are the worst off in terms of its freedom and democracy. They have below average levels of media freedom and very low levels or below average levels of satisfaction with democracy. And then you can see the quadrant just above that's almost empty, only Morocco and Sierra Leone, which means that this quadrant would be high levels of satisfaction and low levels of freedom. The fact that there are only two countries in that suggests that it's almost impossible for people to be satisfied with their democracy unless they have substantive levels of media freedom. So we want the countries defined by, in the quadrant defined by Liberia and Gabon, we want them to move up to where Tanzania is, and they probably got one or two ways to do that, either by increasing their levels of satisfaction or by increasing their media freedom. My suggestion would be that to increase the media freedom would be a more viable way to ultimately secure more satisfaction with democracy. And if, for those of you who understand regression models, basically what we're saying is that the formula predicts that for every 1% increase we have in media freedom, we will have about 1/6 increase in democratic satisfaction. So if we do the same exercise, we use the state of current media freedom and we look at how people view their democracy, the extent of their democracy or the quality of their democracy. We see, for example, that the current state of media freedom predicts about 18% of the variance in the quality of democracy. And you can see, again, if we follow the various quadrants, Tanzania defines one in which media freedom is high and the citizens view the country as a good quality democracy. So the extent of democracy is high as well as media freedom is high. And that's where we want, of course, all countries to be. If we look at the one just below, where there's substantive media freedom, above average media freedom, South Africa, Malawi, Senegal, Mozambique are countries that has above average media freedom, but below average quality of democracy. And then the quadrant just next to it, defined by Gabon and Eswatini, we don't have a lot of media freedom and we don't have a lot of quality democracy. And that's the quadrant that I think is going to be, or currently is the biggest challenge, especially for media and increased media freedom. And then again, you know, it's very difficult to have a country with high levels of quality democracy and low levels of media freedom. We can see that there's only really Liberia that fits that kind of profile. I'll conclude by just saying a few things about social media, because this has become such a huge topic at the moment. Just asking whether people have heard of social media, you can see 71% of Africans said yes, they have heard of social media. Of course, it is something where the awareness is much higher amongst younger age groups than older age groups. You can see it. The yellow bars indicate awareness amongst an age group, and you can see 18 to 24, it's 80%, sorry about that. And for example, amongst the 55 and older group, that's only 51%. So it is something that we have to take into consideration when it comes to looking after our youth. If we look at it, sorry, it's not by age, it is about by country. My apologies for that heading. We could see social media awareness is high in Gabon, 94%, Morocco, 92%, Mauritius, 92%, Cabo Verde, 90%. On the lowest level, it's Ethiopia, 32%, Burkina Faso, 42%, Malawi, just 55, Lesotho, 56, Tanzania, 58. So also when it comes to awareness of social media, we can't assume that it is equally distributed throughout the continent. The effects of social media, we ask a number of factors. And in this case, we combined the categories of people said they agree and strongly agree. So 62% feels it makes people more intolerant. 73% says it helps people to have more impact on politics. 75% it makes people believe more fake news. And 88% it makes people more informed. So it's a mixed bag of positive and negative issues. But I think the idea of fake news being a problem, it's quite high. It's 3 out of every 4 Africans, and a similar amount when it comes to have more impact on politics. And we know that, you know, with the Arab Spring, the role that social media has played has been extensive, but it would be very difficult to have that kind of role, for example, in countries where social media awareness is much lower. So if we look at these kind of effects, I think one needs to understand, you know, what the overall uptake of social media is per country. So asking whether they would support restrictions on the use of internet or social media, or whether they would prefer unrestricted access. These are agreements with the statement. So you can see that 20% agree very strongly to regulated access, and 16% agree to regulated access. So about 36% of Africans feel that it's okay to regulate access to the internet, and the majority, 52%, feel that it shouldn't be regulated. What is quite interesting is the 10%, which is a very large category of respondents that says they don't know. If we look at preference for unrestricted access, countries which are often less free would perhaps have more preference for unrestricted access. Liberia, Benin, Mauritius is a fairly open society. Cabo Verde is a fairly open society. But Zimbabwe, for example, is a society where things aren't always that well with its democracy, and they seem to be in favor of a very high support for unrestricted access. Namibia is 57%, South Africa is the same, Mozambique slightly less. Those countries with below average support for media access, Zambia, Lesotho, Eswatini, Malawi, are all Southern African states. And you can see in Mali, for example, only 29% of people feel that there should be unrestricted access to the internet and social media. What effects will social media have on society? You can see just slightly more than half, 57%, felt that it has a positive impact, either very positive or somewhat positive. 30% has, 14% said neither positive nor negative, and much less hold the view that it is somewhat negative. So in terms of this, social media is still perceived as something with positive effects on society. If we look at where the most positive effects are perceived, it's like Liberia, Niger, Benin, Togo, Sudan, Nigeria, Mauritius is the first Southern African country above the African average. Below that, Botswana, for example, only 35% sees it as positive. Tanzania, only 39% see it as positive. South Africa, only 42% see it as positive. Zambia, 49%. Namibia, 50%. So it appears as if Southern African countries have a more negative outlook, or a less positive outlook, let me put it that way, than the rest. So that's me then for taking you through this. I hope that I wasn't too quick, but I welcome all your questions.
Thank you so much, Christie. That was a very comprehensive feedback and charts and research you've done there. So thank you so much. And some very surprising information that came, from this survey. The floor is open now for the participants to ask Christie some questions. But Christie, I'd just like to ask, while we wait for them to come through, for you to talk us through the demographic that was used for participation in the survey.
These are nationally representative samples, so they would reflect, for example, for age, they would reflect the national profile in terms of the age pyramid. We impose a 50-50 gender quota, so 50% of respondents will be women, and for the rest, there are no special manipulations of samples. What we do is we create weights for the countries, so that countries that are smaller in terms of their sample are not deemed less important against those larger countries where the samples are bigger. So that's the only way we weight. But the age, there's no weights for age. An age should, because of the fact that the sample is selected in the way it did, or it was, that it would become, sort of a reflection of the society. Of course, Africa's got a very young population. That also means that the majority of our respondents are young. Say between 18, we only include people of voting age. So 18 is our cutoff point. So between 18 and 35, I assume would be the largest section of the population, both in life and in the sample.
That's interesting, because you did mention in one of your slides there that about 70% of the participants of the survey, wanted or agreed to government monitoring news/information. And I was wondering, what that would mean for media freedom in the long run. And one would assume the younger generation would understand the importance of media freedom much more. But Zoe, if you're still on there, I would actually like you to answer this question and just give your perspective on, hearing that 70% plus, of the participants in the survey would want government to monitor news and information. What would that mean for media freedom in the long run, Zoe?
Well, that is very worrisome. And I think it probably stems from two things. The lack of engagement by the media with their current audiences, the lack of understanding of the role of the media in society. And yes, this issue that Khadija was speaking of before, engagement with audiences, providing news and information in formats that are relevant to them, and just making them feel a lot more engaged and active in public life. It is a great concern because those of us who advocate for media freedom and freedom of expression are trying to, develop mass movements to support the rights to media freedom and freedom of expression. So it is indeed very worrisome.
But also another interesting development or interesting information, pieces of information that came from the survey was that radio is the most popular form of media platform for news. And, when it comes to, as you just mentioned, Zoe, engaging, educating the youth on the importance of media freedom, one would think that social media news platforms would be the place to find them. So was that surprising to you as well?
It's very surprising, but at the same time, I've been an advocate for, or maybe I'm just a bit old school. I'm a strong advocate for the use of traditional media and not, having this attitude that, newspapers should be, put out to pasture. That kind of thing. I think that newspapers are still relevant, radio especially, and I think Christie has emphasized that a number of times, the importance of radio. So again, it takes us back to understanding where people access news, how they access news, and how they filter news. Thanks.
Christie, right at the beginning, you said that there's been a 15-year decline of democracy and freedom. I want to know, do you have any, feedback for us on what the contributing factors were to this 15-year decline? Because I think that piece of information took some of us by surprise as well.
Well, I think, the data that sort of supports that graphic I showed comes from Freedom House, and they've just released 2020's World of Freedom report, which gives a detailed explanation of why in every country that they've downgraded, that has been the case. But I think globally, a couple of things have happened there. One is that in developing countries, major donors have withdrawn their support to democratic projects as they've been cutting down on development aid to these countries. Namibia, for example, is a very good example where there's very little funding available for projects dealing with governance or democracy. The world seemed to have moved on, or the Western world. At the same time, we see the increased participation in these countries by authoritarian states such as China, Russia, and they're filling that void that, sort of left when the pro-democracy forces move out. I think COVID has been another stimulus in some countries just to push things even further in the authoritarian sphere. Governments found a way through COVID to curtail people's rights. And some of them liked it a lot and continues to do that beyond what is needed to fight the pandemic. At the same time, I think there's a global rise in populism, a global sort of inward-looking phase where nationalism is becoming a more important ideology. So I think all those global forces are putting pressure onto sort of democratic forces. So what we see is that it's not a case that governments become authoritarian, with a blink of an eye, like a coup, some kind of spectacular event where, a military force takes over a country or something like that. What we see is the hollowing out of democratic institutions and practices and the gradual suspension of democratic rules and regimes. So it's not a spectacular event, but it's a systemic undermining of democracy, or hollowing out, if you like. So I think it depends also, of course, on the country, but on the continent, I think the driving force has definitely been COVID has had a huge impact, but also the sort of gradual withdrawal of pro-democratic forces from many African countries.
Well, Patrick, there are some questions in the chat box for Christie. Do you mind just giving those through, please?
So I've got it. The first question is from Teleforest, and it says, not sure if I missed this slide, but I wonder if the survey went on to establish the reasons some participants prefer government control over the media.
Yes, of course. It's part of what we could sort of tease out from the data. I'm not entirely sure that I have all the answers for that right now. I think it's also something that would be perhaps country specific. But I think, just on a broad level, the change in democratic freedom and media freedom has put a squeeze onto people. I think there's a general sense that there's a lot of misinformation around, especially now during COVID. I think there's almost a kind of a support to say from government to take control and keep away at least some of this very confusing information that's flying around. So, I think in some countries, of course, there is simply the attempt to curtail the media, to promote an authoritarian alternative, or at least an attempt at an authoritarian or populist alternative. So it's one of those mysteries. Namibia presents South Africa as another, that sort of, for example, when we look at democracy, where there's less support for democracy or there's less demand for democracy than there is supply. Namibians get, and South Africans feel that they get generally a good deal, but they don't necessarily support it. A kind of a contradictory position. So I can't answer it in great detail, but I think the context explains a lot. We have a squeeze down on this. So I think, with more time and more space, one can look at the data and arrive at more specific overall possible reasons. But I think it's also something that might be country specific.
Okay, that's also very interesting. A question for countries like Lesotho: did the survey reach out to communities in the rural and remotest areas of the country?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Afrobarometer is drawn from national sample frames, and it covers the entire population, irrespective of where they live.
Okay. Another input from Wisdom is that it is likely to remain dominant for longer, given our audience demographics, dominance of rural masses. So in terms of, I think radio being the prominent medium, but just maybe, just to catapult on that idea, do we look at, for instance, multiple sources, multiple mediums in this context, or does the data generally, because I think if the nature of cumulative journalistic sources and the effect that has, how does that relate in this context?
Yeah, again, I don't have the statistics, but certainly what we can do is we could look at overlap in preferences, which I think we would find. People use more than one source of media for daily news. And I think the kind of thing that I see developing now in many media houses is that they're all going sort of via a variety of platforms. And I think that's definitely something that will keep on growing. Don't forget that in Africa, we still have an issue with internet access. So I think television is, as we've seen, is not as important for everyone. In some countries it is much more than other countries. But radio is the one platform that you can get by on using very traditional technology. But it also opens up new opportunities with exciting new modern technology. I think it's the one that is perhaps all round, the one with the best potential still. And then, I think it is true that I could read a newspaper and I could listen to the radio and I could watch television, of course, depending on what is available and how interested I am in what is the news of the day or the issues of the day.
I see we've got another comment. Let me just see there. Once again from Teleforest, he has a comment saying the Tanzania case is really interesting. We've long had reports of government attempts here to stifle free media operation. Would be interesting to know if the definition of media freedom was the same in all the countries the survey was conducted. Indeed, I agree with that. It would be interesting to know that. Also, one thing that stood out within the survey was about the public support for media freedom in Namibia, which was quite low. I think it was on 52 or 55%. So it begs the question, what are we not doing? And not just as media institutes, because the onus isn't solely on us to educate on the importance of media freedom. But as the media fraternity, what are we not doing right for our people to understand the importance and to garner their support for media freedom? Zoe, I know I've exhausted you this morning, but perhaps you have some sentiments on that?
I was thinking maybe let Christie answer that, because I have just typed a question in the chat box and I really want an answer to that question. So I know that the timekeeper is going to be knocking on our door shortly.
All right, Christie?
Okay, let me just say a couple of things about Tanzania. I think Tanzania is interesting. It's interesting for a variety of reasons. I don't have all the answers to the Tanzanian questions because I haven't looked at it in any specific detail. The way the questions are asked, you can read it at how we've asked the question about media freedom. We don't present people with definitions. That in research terms is guiding people, it's distorting people, it's introducing a bias. So we've simply asked the question the way that I've put it down at the bottom of that. So remember, we're working with perceptions. Perceptions are people's realities, but it doesn't mean to say it's the same reality as an expert's reality. So we have to live with the fact that people report on how they see the world, and that shapes how they act to that world. Just a kind of a note on that. I think the context, Zoe's question, how do we reach youthful Africans and engage them in a manner that is relevant to them? I've looked recently at a work work that I've done for Namibia Media Trust on youth and politics. And it is true that the youth has a different way of interacting with politics. But I've also learned that depending on who you define as the youth, the younger generation, 18 to say 24, versus the older generations, the younger 18 to 24 people emerge from school, they have no background in politics. They might not have had any serious socialization at home or in school in politics. So they're very inexperienced. How much can we really expect from them? Versus the generation 25 and over, these people would probably have started a job, they would be paying taxes, they would sort of engage with life in a costly manner, meaning having to start paying their way. All these sorts of things could introduce them to politics, having to feel the price of services in town, or having to pay an increase in taxes or increases in fuel prices. So they may be not as ignorant about politics and hence sort of perhaps more inclined to participate in some ways. So I think we need to design perhaps things that deal with this very young group who might be on an interesting sabbatical with high levels of youth unemployment. This group will probably go into the 25 plusers, which is worrying, because if you're 18 to 24, everybody gives you a bit of a break. You're going to study, you have a gap year, you do all these sorts of things. But after 25, you have to become a contributing member to society. In other words, you have to find a job, you have to pay your taxes. If after 25, you're still unemployed, it means somebody else has got to carry that cost, either your family or the state. What we see now, Namibia, for example, the UN argues that the average Namibian young person will remain financially dependent on their parents until they're 27 years old. It might be different for other countries. So the benefits that we're supposed to get from this youth bulge doesn't really exist. We also saw in that paper that the youth is less likely to participate and less likely to protest, especially the very younger people. They have no real experience with institutions. They don't really engage with institutions. So the media might be the only way to actually reach this group, the very young ones, and then try and get them engaged. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think multimedia strategies, perhaps. I think a lot of basic education, civic education, political education, media education, media literacy, political literacy, all those kinds of things. But it's going to take time, and you've got, about 4 years to capture this group. before they move on to the next. I think in the fallout of COVID, we may find that members of this youngest group will be hard to reach because they would probably not find employment, which means they might retreat back into the rural areas where it's difficult to find them. It may lead to some kind of anti-establishment feelings, disengagement from government, state institutions, the political sphere. We already saw in the Namibian case that they hardly engage with political parties, so they will be difficult to mobilize. But at the same time, I think technology and new media creates exciting opportunities to deal with this group. For me, the key issue around trust in the media is the fact that the media has to provide some kind of sanity in an environment that is becoming quite insane. Insane in the sense that freedoms are being curtailed, insane in the sense that democratic quality is being undermined. Corruption has become a global entity, deeply entrenched in global networks, links local politicians and businesses into a very sophisticated global network. I think it promotes a lot of distrust and cynicism. I think on the other end, media is struggling to become sustainable or to remain sustainable. Some publications had not survived COVID. So I think it's a very, very challenging environment. And I'm not an expert in media sustainability, but I think the quest to find new business models and a quest to find sort of messages will be necessary, but also difficult because of the circumstances that we live in. If you consider this, I mean, Facebook extract local taxes in all our countries, but doesn't pay taxes in our countries. At the same time, because of a variety of reasons, economics of scale, for example, they can compete with local media outlets for advertising fees. So it's a double blow. One is that not only the local media put under pressure, but at the same time, we don't derive any benefits for the funding that we provide them, as they don't put anything back in the form of taxes. And I think, those kinds of things, to me, are the worrying things. At the same time, I think there are opportunities. Anyway, but let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Christie, for your very informative and comprehensive session there. And we're going to take a little break now.
Siveza iqiniso, sivuselela ukuthembeka.